Gaywyck by Vincent Verga. Publisher Allison Books, Los Angeles, New York. Narrator Eric Aust. As there were only 2 beds in the house, it was arranged that Danough and I would share the one in my former room, and the 2 religious would share the one in my parents' room. Danough unpacked my bag and laid my nightshirt across my pillow. We undressed by the flickering light of a small yellow candle. I got into bed first. He blew out the candle. Once under the covers, I began to shiver. Sister Theresa had warmed the bed, but it was cold. I called for a hot water bottle. He laughed and said our body heat would suffice. The bed seemed enormous. He was nowhere to be felt. Where are you? On my side of the bed. You seem in an undiscovered country. He laughed again, stretching out my hand to reach for him. I touched his bare chest. Don't you have a nightshirt? I never wear them. What do you wear? Nothing. I'm wearing my undershorts tonight. Why? There was a pause. It's very cold. Try to sleep. I don't know how I ever managed to leave this house. I feel 10 years old here. Go to sleep. Yes, sir. Good night, Danough. He reached across the wide expanse of bed between us and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. You'll be fine, he whispered. I feel fine. Good. Go to sleep now. Obediently, I went to sleep. I don't remember having a thought after Danough's words, but no sooner had I dropped into sleep than I stood looking down at my sleeping friend. The comforter had slipped away, exposing his muscular chest. I raked my fingers through the thick, coarse hair before drawing the blankets up to his throat. The cold pummeled me. I crossed the room to close the bedroom door. The floor in my room was covered by a thin film of ice. It was snowing heavily in the hallway. My bare feet left no prints. I knew I was dreaming and felt a certain relief. The door to the front parlor was rolled open. My father waited. Inside the room, he was kneeling beside his coffin. The windows were open. Drifts of powdered snow were in corners against the legs of chairs on the bookshelves, and on the side of my father that faced the wind. A gust tore off my nightshirt. Naked, I approached him. He stiffly embraced me and effortlessly lifted me into the coffin. Snow covered me, encased in the frozen white. I sensed him reclaim his place in the box on top of me. I watched. A lid slid over the box, nailed into place by a weeping Father Howard in a white robe. The snow around me hardened. I could no longer breathe. I screamed in desperation and then awoke. Danough wrapped his arms around me and drew me close to him. I trembled, suddenly exploding with grief. The force of the pain made me cry out again. He hugged me tightly. His warmth enveloped me. I wept, penetrated by his tenderness. Pressing my face to his chest, I could feel his heart beating, which calmed me more than the gentle words he was whispering. Opening my hands, I flattened my palms against his shoulder blades. Moving my feet, I settled them on his warm ankles. Curled against him, breathing his musky firmness, I felt my own weakness and cried for many things. That thou didst know how many fathoms deep I am in love, but it cannot be sounded. My affection hath an unknown bottom, like the bay of Portugal. I then slept a deep and dreamless sleep. I awoke at 7:30 to find him dressed and standing by the bed holding a cup of hot milk. While I sipped the milk, he banked the fire, laid out my clothing, and then went to the kitchen to fetch out water for my bath. Ordered out of my nightshirt, I stepped into the metal tub, which he'd set up in front of the fire. The bath was a perfect antidote. I felt able to face the day. The nuns served breakfast. Sister Theresa and Danough had both risen at dawn, finding themselves together. They had shared the time talking of Paris and London, a conversation they had continued over the morning meal. Sister Josephia was quiet, reflective. I was foully depressed, listening to the 2 of them discussing places my father had always dreamed of visiting. Made me sad. He would never feed the peacocks in Holland Park. He would never see Bernini's Lover, and why? because he never had the courage to lead his life as he wanted. But what was it he had wanted? The carriage arrived for us, a hearse for my father. Miss Gramond, having offered her carriage for the two nuns, was present to ride with them. We all gathered in the parlor to pray and to pay our last respects. Then we waited outside, huddled together, while Mr. Teal and his son fastened the lid to the coffin. The sound of hammering quieted any attempts at conversation. Danough and I rode with Father Howard. The Mass was suddenly a burden to his heart. His grief made everything seem complex and unmanageable. There was no one to play for the service. My father was the church organist until that morning. Father Howard had not realized Andrew Whyte would not be playing at his own requiem. Miss Gramond volunteered, but panicked and retracted her offer. Danough saw no problem. He would play. It is a low requiem, Father. Alas, yes. Mr. Gaylord, securing a deacon, subdeacon, and a choir is as impossible here as it was in the Middle Ages. Andrew never tired of drawing parallels. My father would prefer a low requiem, Father. Yes, Robbie, I know. I take comfort in that. I patted his arm affectionately. I noticed he wore the gloves I sent him for Christmas. My father claimed he maintained his connection with the church because, as schoolmaster, it was a necessary obligation, and because it was the only opportunity he had to play the organ. Now I realized it was for his friendship with Father Howard as well. The priest left us the moment we arrived at the church. Neighbors had gathered to assist us from the carriage. The mayor, the sheriff, and members of the school board lifted my father from the hearse. Father Howard appeared in his black cassock and white lace chasuble on the church steps to give us the greeting at the door. He solemnly intoned, "Come to his assistance, ye saints of God. Come forth to meet him, ye angels of the Lord. Receiving his soul, offer it in the sight of the Most High." My aunt, Sister Theresa, and I followed the casket down the center aisles. To my surprise, why was I surprised? The church was full. I remember very little of the service. Father Howard moved gracefully through the ritual, and the nuns on either side quietly recited his responses with the acolytes. I remembered the music. At one point, I began brooding over the image of my father. Andrew Whyte, the soul of the faithful departed, being delivered from the pains of hell, from the bottomless pit, from the lion's mouth, and from eternal darkness by the holy standard-bearer, Michael, when the sacred music brought the archangel into our midst, wearing wings of fire. His sword, a rainbow of sound, illuminated the air as clearly as the sunbeams that pierced the colored windows. "Your father is most fortunate in his gifted organist," Sister Theresa whispered. "Farrer's music will carry his soul to heaven directly." After the final benediction, the priest walked from the altar to the bier and commenced the absolution of burial service. He spoke of judgment and verdict, then he sang of the day of wrath. He sang of fear and terror. He prayed my father was not handed over to the enemy, since he, my forefather, had believed in him and had hoped in him and theoretically merited everlasting joys, rather than undergoing the punishments of fiery hell forever and ever and ever. "Through Christ our Lord." "Amen," we all answered in unison, voices dulled. "An end," I wanted to shout at them all. "An end to your fear and fire and terror. An end to your tigers and lions, to your Abraham and Lazarus and Jerusalem." In a rage, I started to cry for my father, helpless in that black draped box, having this ritualistic outrage perpetrated on him, sprinkled upon his head, his heart, his groin, his feet. Then the music soared and carried me with it. My rage was dissipated, my fury quelled. I felt a peace as serene as the sacred music that consecrated the ground we all occupied. I returned to myself. A Sister Theresa touched my hand. It was time for us to leave for the cemetery. I gazed into her beautiful face. How could this wonderful woman believe in all this hideous nonsense? Give her life to perpetrate it. Then Denver's voice echoed in my head. And what then is love but need? More, much more. I watched my father's coffin being carried up the aisle. I surrendered to the rush of Danough's music, stepping from the pew. I followed obediently. Large, wet flakes of snow fell on us all at the graveside. Take away out of their hearts the spirit of rebellion and teach them to see the good and gracious purpose working in all the trials which thou dost send upon them. Thank you, God, I prayed as they lowered my father into the ground. Thank you for showing me your good and gracious purpose. And my good and gracious purpose, to love and be loved is all. Nothing else matters. God, life is too short for more than one goal. Oh, dear Papa, we are leaving you in that hole. Don't leave me, Papa. I'm sorry, Papa. Danough took my arm and led me back to the carriage. The snow stopped, and the iron-gray sky brightened. Goodbye, I whispered as the sun appeared. Goodbye, God. Non serviam. When we reached the house, there was a surprise awaiting me in the front parlor. My mother, accompanied by Dr. Anders, sat in the sun-soaked chair near the open windows of my dream. I approached her slowly from the windows of my dream. I approached her slowly. From the doorway, she appeared to be asleep. I did not want to frighten her. Hearing my footfalls, she looked up from her meditation and smiled. She had aged gently, and her resemblance to my secret friend was astonishing. Surely Danough saw it. The doctor thought the service would be too great a strain, but I wanted to see you in the house and pay my respects to your father as best I could. I kissed her. She rose slowly from the chair, holding my hand. She walked me to the sofa. I am much better, thanks to you and Mr. Gaylord and Dr. Anders. Soon I'll be able to come home. Isn't that so, Dr. Anders? Dr. Anders, thin and nervous-looking, nodded. I'd prefer you not selling the house right away, dear. Mother, the house is yours, not mine. You can do with it what you will. No, Robert, dear. The house is yours now. Mad people may not own property. Isn't that so, Dr. Anders? Dr. Anders, seemingly thinner and more nervous-looking, nodded again. As far as I'm concerned, Mother, the house is yours. You won't sell it. No. How can I sell what is mine? Then I'll keep it. You've grown so, become such a man. Good, I mumbled, pleased but embarrassed. How was the funeral? I shrugged. What could I say? I never could understand how your father tolerated Roman Catholicism. It must have been his fondness for guilt. My mother always said I would never be happy with one of them. I could not have been happy with one of anything. I was never happy with myself. She continued to chatter happily. I continued to listen and make the appropriate responses, but all the while I was aware of her love for me, and I marveled how she had nurtured in me a need to love and be loved. I wondered if she were aware of the great gift she had given me. Across the room, Danough Gaylord sat talking with Miss Vermont. I had never seen her so comfortable with anyone else before. Just at that moment, she lifted her hand and gave it to him. I always thought you were the best-looking man in the world, son. Oh, I said, grinning. And now, Mama? Now I think the golden apple must be shared with Mr. Gaylord. Gladly, Mama, gladly. The eyes are remarkable, Dr. Anders. Yes, Mrs. Whyte. Do all beautiful men look alike? I shouldn't think so, Mrs. Whyte. Why do you ask? I wanted a professional opinion, Doctor. Then she laughed. The same soft, warm, throaty chuckle that always made me laugh with her. He's convinced I'm one endless non sequitur. It gives me pleasure not to disappoint him. I glanced at Dr. Anders. He was smiling to himself. He caught my glance and winked at me. I realized he wasn't the nervous-looking one. I was. Sister Theresa offered me a sandwich. I ate it, then rose to get another. Detouring, I approached Miss Grimond, who shyly extended her hand to me. Robert, I'm sorry we have not had time to talk. Next time, perhaps? You owe me a letter, I said. She nodded and promised to write. Again, I was grateful to her. She had agreed to accept responsibility for the house until such time as my mother would inhabit it again. I thanked her for her kindness. She said it was the least she could do. It was time for my mother to leave. Everyone gathered around her. For a brief while, as the center of attention, she looked young again. My heart swelled with a particular sadness for her and for myself, and for each who had seen her beauty eroded by her bruising sorrow. She clung to me and whispered into my ears. Take good food and rest, my little boy. Be happy with yourself. Love yourself and love me if you can. Forgive your papa. He drank, you know. Is that what she thought his guilt was? She and Dr. Anders left. Father Howard, distant and removed, offered to drive Danough and me to our train, scheduled to arrive at 12:42. Miss Grimond and Sister Theresa ordered the room, fluffing pillows and collecting sandwich plates. Sister Josephia took me into the kitchen. Write to me, Robbie. Yes, I will. I promise. I will. I'd like that. So would I, dear. You look exhausted, Auntie Em. You know I am. I look forward to getting back to Our Lady of Good Counsel in case you haven't noticed I'm getting old. 80 next month. If God spares me, give me a kiss. I kissed her on the cheek. She smiled of sweet powder. Your father was a good man, she said, hugging me. We had our differences, but he was a good man. I had forgotten he was dead. How could that have happened? The weight in my heart was identified anew. I blushed for my crassness. As if reading my mind, she continued, each of us reacts to death differently. While I was cutting the sandwiches, I actually forgot why I was here. I never could get a grasp on death. I looked confused. She laughed. Even Jesus had trouble comprehending death when his time on the cross came. If it proved a mystery to the Son of God, who am I to understand it? I accept it as his will. Is there any other way? I shrugged. I shook my head. I pray for your father's soul, Robbie. It helps him. And it makes me feel better. I wish there was something to make you feel better. I'll be fine, Auntie Em. I'll be just fine. She scrutinized my face, then hugged me with all her strength. I know you will. But I'll pray for you anyway. You may not want me to, but I will. It will help you through the difficult times ahead. You'll see. Of course I want you to. I need all the love I can get. She hugged me for the last time. Loving is easy, she whispered. It's living that's hard. Saying my goodbyes to Sister Theresa, I was moved when she kissed me on the cheek. Take care of Danough Gaylord, she said. It's he who takes care of me, sister. Well then, take care of each other. We laughed. I was struck again by her loveliness and promised to write. From the carriage, we waved to the three women in the doorway. As we drove away from the house, I felt a wrenching grief in my stomach. I don't know why it's so hard to leave. It's no longer my home. Home is always home, Robbie, Father Howard said. You grow older and make your own life, and you have more than one, that's all. Auntie Emily was right. What'd she say? She said loving is easy. It's living that's hard. For some of us, Danough replied. Neither comes easily. The train was waiting when we reached the station. I had taken several boxes of my father's books, packing them hastily after the conversation with my aunt in the kitchen. Sister Theresa had been reading the copy of The Winter's Tale I'd sent him for Christmas. She found it by the bed and carried it into the kitchen. Seeing it convinced me that I wanted something belonging to him. Of the books we both loved seemed the most appropriate. I had gone up to his study and randomly selected ones he had shared with me. In the right-hand drawer of his desk, I uncovered the journal for the last year of his life. I took it. Frightened and grieving, I took it and placed it safely on the bottom of one of the boxes. We were barely settled on board when the train began the long journey back to New York City. Throughout the afternoon during tea, while the sun blazed orange and the sky shifted from dove gray to lavender, until the train reached Hoboken, Danough Gaylord and I talked together of ourselves, our thoughts, our feelings, and our dreams. I was stirred anew by his goodness, his gentleness, his intelligence, and his compassion. He blamed no one for his failings. He praised everyone for his strengths and his blessings. He spoke of his love for his mother and for his father with such candor, at times expressing feelings so akin to mine that I frequently interrupted him, and he me. He would smile as if to say, I knew these all along. I admired him, and respected him, and loved him. I prayed our time together would be for all time. I knew not to what or whom, but I did pray. I stayed the night at Gramercy Park. I was exhausted following a bath and a very late supper. I said good night. We had not discussed how long I would stay in town, but I assumed it would be for several days. Next morning, descending for breakfast, I heard a woman's voice inside Danough's study. It was a lovely voice, velvety and beautifully modulated. I stopped on the landing to listen to its cadence, which suddenly faltered, and was halted by sobs. The door opened. Danough appeared in the corridor. Signing me, he requested a glass of water, pronto. I rushed back to my room and quickly returned to the corridor, but he was gone, and the door was closed. Should I knock? The sobs began again. I knocked. He called for me to enter. Seated in a chair in front of the fire, dressed in a plain brown frock, devoid of all adornment, was the young woman. Her brown hair was carelessly piled on top of her bowed head. Seeing me, she forced a smile. I recognized the face as a Jones face. I was pleased to see she had Price's teeth, white and square rather than the others. Gratefully, she took the water. I moved to exit, but she spoke. I stopped, thinking it was directed to me. I can't accept your money, she said, which most certainly was not directed at me, but when no one asked me to leave, I stayed. I'm not offering it to you. I'm offering it to your children. It's not the same thing, Mr. Gaylord. I don't want your charity. It isn't charity. Mrs. Davis, Gwilym worked for me 4 years ago for 2 months. They fired him because he was drunk all the time. Makes no matter. He was an employee of mine. I won't accept it, and that is an end to it. What will you do? Get a job. What everyone does. And the children? I don't know. I can't take your money, Mr. Gaylord. It isn't like father. Gwilym's death was nothing to you. Why don't you leave us alone? You and your family are my responsibility. Nonsense. I won't ever be dependent on any man ever again. All right, Mrs. Davis. You can work for me at Gaywyck. I nearly shouted at him. Luckily, I remembered my place and clenched my diaphragm, extinguishing all sounds. What? She exclaimed for me. You and your family can live at Gaywyck. Denver's is always in need of good help. In the fall, the children can begin school in the village. The country will do you all good. I expected her to protest. Instead, she rose and walked silently to the window. I waited breathlessly. The very thought of these 3 urchins careening up and down the... I'll have to think of this, Mr. Gaylord. By all means, take your time. I'll continue with Gwilym's pension until you decide. But this is absurd, she spoke very softly, no longer arguing. Mr. Gaylord, it was a blessed hour when you crossed our path, the only day God was ever on our side. Thank you, sir. You are a splendid man. When she turned toward us, she was smiling, very like her brothers, but her features were smaller and cooperated without tension. She was remarkably pretty in a vixenish way. Danough sighed. He had won. I felt ill. Running in and out of rooms, I thought, miserable, screaming and fighting, breaking things. Danough introduced me to Margaret Davis. Excitedly, she crossed to me, extending her hand, which I took dazed by her exuberance at meeting the librarian. I'm very pleased to know you, Mr. Whyte. Price says you're a wonderful fellow. really decent and good. He thinks the world of you. Says your gift to Teo made all the difference for him. Nonsense, I corrected her, charmed. He made all the difference himself. We all walked down together. She would not stay to breakfast. She had parked her children with a kind neighbor and did not want to impose on anyone. Over her first cup of tea, he suggested lunch at his club and a few hours at his gymnasium to keep ourselves in shape. Gymnasium? I go there 3 times a week to swim, to box, lift the weights, and play tennis with good body when he's free. Does he play well? He was varsity champion at Yale. Does Mortimer play too? Not well. He prefers throwing pigskins to hitting a ball over a net with paddles. Football's his game. He was varsity captain at Yale. Good Lord. If you intend to keep up with us this summer at Gaywyck, you had better begin preparing now. I'll set up a gym for you there. You must keep fit. I'll have the equipment brought down from the attic to where it used to be across from the art room. There's even a shower head in the bath to make it official. He laughed at my obvious fright. Well, I thought 15 minutes a day before tea would not hurt. I looked across the table at the breadth of his shoulders and remembered the musculature of his chest and back. All the years of dreaming had not made me grow tall and muscular. Perhaps some concerted effort wasn't a bad idea. We lunched at his club, a mausoleum of Fifth Avenue, where a dozen men interrupted our meal to ask questions about business matters. Each man appeared old enough to be his father. We then went on to his gymnasium, stopping in a sporting goods shop to outfit me. I was terrified, convinced I'd make an ass of myself and disgrace him in front of his friends. He was very patient, introducing me to the men who were in charge of the different sections and explaining nonchalantly that this was my first visit and guidance was in order. They examined me, testing my skills and my strength before directing my attention to the various simple implements designed to aid my healthy growth. All very scientific, and I had nothing to be ashamed of. My body was in excellent condition. I had always eaten properly. Since living at Gaywyck, I exercised vigorously, walking and swimming and riding Anidia regularly. I was complimented and encouraged to develop my possibilities, jargon reminiscent of Horatio Alger. The kind man in charge of the iron weights was the sternest. He warned I was not to endanger my natural physique by becoming muscle-bound. I agreed, making a mental note to ask Danough how lifting lumps of iron could hinder the digestion. He demonstrated how one develops one's musculature without bunching, how one adds firmness and tone but no unsightly bulk, how one limbers but never hinders the body's singular movement. The man was an artist. He pointed to Danough Gaylord as the perfect example of a vigorous, healthy, virile specimen. I watched my protector exercise with small weights, systematically stretching the toned muscles of his bare torso. I committed myself forever to physical fitness. In the pool and the showers, surrounded by naked men, I felt uncomfortable, until I took my place among them. Full-length mirrors lined on one wall of the aquatic sports room. Standing at the edge of the pool with him by my side, I looked at myself in relation to him. I was no longer a child. The lines of my body had hardened, and the heavy blonde down on my legs, chest, and buttocks was rapidly darkening in patterns similar to his. I was no longer skinny. I was no longer small. I've grown, I said, scritching taller. Yes, you have. The change is remarkable. I may get to be as tall as you. And wouldn't that be fine? He nodded, puzzled, obviously not understanding my pleasure at the thought. He dived into the water. I remained at the edge, looking at myself in relation to the other male bodies reflected. Most of them were far removed from the classical ideal, though young. They were paunched and flabby and soft. They waddled like gulls, and except for the hair that sprouted in all the same places, they had the pudgy form of newborn babes. The exceptions, the godly men, were not all classically perfect, but had grace and took pleasure in their beauty. I stared boldly, embarrassing several. There is more to love than need, I thought as I dived into the water, highly amused by the techniques naked men employ to avoid appearing to be looking at one another. I felt exhilarated. There is something very special about male bodies, something very Cezanne in all those planes and angles. The pool was refreshing. It was instructive as well. Danough Gaylord worked furiously hard. For 2 solid hours he put his body through the most grueling exercise, and as I floated lazily in the water, he swam with a trainer, clocking his time. He joined me, pleased with his performance. We swam together, pausing to play. When I pushed his head under the surface, the staid gentleman did not approve. Danough said we had to behave like adults, or they would not renew his membership. We swam the length of the pool twice, like proper strangers, then headed for the showers. I contained myself. I wanted to tell everyone that the man by my side was my comrade. It was natural for us to frolic in their pool. I contented myself with touching his arm and asking him to write Denver's about my gymnasium immediately. That night, I fell asleep the moment my head was comfortably settled on the pillow. I don't know how long I slept, but there were many convoluted dreams before the one involved my father. He stood by my bed, leaned over, and kissed my hair. His face in the darkness outlined by a halo's glow. I reached to embrace him. He vanished, yet the halo remained, floating like a golden ring of smoke. I groaned and woke with a sickening jolt. I heard the bedroom door open and footsteps approach. Danough, in a gray satin robe, the color of the morning sea, stood by my bed. He came to say goodbye. I sobbed. He sat on the bed and gently stroked my face. Please, come under the covers and hold me. There was a rustle of satin as the robe slid from his body. I felt the bed shift, and the cool air touched me as he settled beside me. And then he wrapped me in his arms, and I pressed myself against him. "Where's your nightshirt?" he asked roughly. I started to explain that I was following his example and not wearing one any longer, when my particular sorrow, with the unexpected violence of Jones's punch, threw me into a fit of convulsive weeping and stopped 10 minutes later, only because I could no longer sustain it. Limp and exhausted between sighs and mild hiccups, I told him I loved him. "I love you too, Robbie." There was barely time for another sigh before I fell asleep as deeply as if a potion had been administered. When I woke, he was gone. One of his embossed gray envelopes was propped against the lamp on my bedside. Inside was a note. "My dear Robert, I am called away on business. I think it best if you return to Gaywyck on the morning train. If possible, I will visit for Easter. D.G." He said he loved me. That's more than I expected. Rising, I dressed and went down to breakfast. Before leaving, I wrote a very short note, just 2 words. "Thank you." I signed it, "Love, Robert." Brian met me at the Sterling Harbor station. He wore a black band on his right arm for my father, which touched me more than he could have guessed. I kissed him in greeting. After pulling away in amazement, he returned my kiss and added a hug. "I missed you, Brian. I love Gaywyck." "You're an idiot." "Why?" "Denver's and Keys had a terrible fight." "Over Jones?" "No," he exclaimed. "Over Cale." "Cale? He's gone." "Gone?" I shouted. "What do you mean, gone?" "He's gone. No one knows where he is. Denver swears Keys killed him." "Keys?" "Beethoven's back." I could not catch my breath. "I knew you'd be upset, Robbie. Don't worry. We'll find him." Not back 10 minutes, and already the descent into chaos begins. How could Cale be gone? I shouted over Frenchie's hooves, pounding on the frozen road. Who would hurt Cale? "Jones! Jones did it! That ugly bastard has killed my Cale!" It could not be any other way, I thought. There was no room for doubt. How could I have been so blind? Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.